Good morning and welcome to the virtual county con meeting day 2. I'm Chris Schlup from Wisconsin Land & Water and will be moderating this session. You're in the main room and we're pleased to have Chris Clayton from Wisconsin DNR give us an update on DNR's targeted performance standard. If you're looking for the Adapting to Challenges session, you'll need to exit this meeting and join room B, which you can see in the schedule at a glance in the chat. Please put any questions in the chat and they'll be addressed at the end of Chris's presentation as time allows. And if we can't get to all the questions, that's okay because we're recording this session and the chat and we can respond later if necessary. Chris Clayton manages the agricultural runoff section at DNR, which includes the CAFO permitting program and agricultural non-point source program. He is leading the DNR's development of a targeted agricultural performance standard for nitrate. Welcome, Chris.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. I appreciate that. Welcome, everybody. Good morning. Yeah, so thanks to Wisconsin Land & Water for inviting us to give an update on the nitrate targeted performance standard. Go ahead and go to the next slide here. Okay. So many of you probably heard over the course of last year news about the nitrate targeted performance standard. In particular, there were some a public comment period where the scope statement for the rule was taken out to provide comment from the public and then brought back to the Natural Resources Board, where they approved in December the scope statement and gave approval to move forward with the rule, in addition to approval for the public hearings that would take place in 2021 on this rule. The scope statement lists that the purpose of revising the administrative code NR 151 is to establish targeted agricultural non-point source performance standards that reduce nitrate pollution in areas of the state with highly permeable soils that are susceptible to groundwater contamination, and that achieve compliance with the nitrate groundwater standards. Next slide, please. So I know for a lot of you, not a whole lot about the process is known beyond that, really. And so for today's presentation, in a nutshell, I want to bring everybody up to speed on where we are with the rule right now. I'm going to be providing, first of all, a little bit of context for the proposed rule change in NR 151, as well as a rule timeline and the process that's before us right now. And then give a little bit of an overview of the technical advisory committee discussions that have taken place so far and some of the input that they've provided on this rule as well. All right, next slide. All right, thanks. So the whole purpose of the administrative code NR 151, as many of you in the room already know, is to runoff pollution performance standards for ag, non-agricultural and transportation facilities, all with the goal of those performance standards being in place to achieve water quality standards. Now the rules themselves do create a process to develop and disseminate non-ag technical standards. However, when it comes to the agricultural performance standards, of course, the technical standards portion of those are promulgated through DATCAP's rule, ATCP 50. NR 151 goes on to further specify how to develop targeted performance standards in cases where statewide performance standards do not achieve the water quality standards as intended. Next slide. Just an overview real quick of some of the performance standards that are existing in NR 151. They address erosion, tillage setback, phosphorus index, which was added in the early 2010s, clean water diversions, and of course, nutrient management. Next slide. All right. So also included in NR 151 are the manure management prohibitions. These prohibitions, as they're the slide are also included in statute and then reiterated in NR 151. In general, the state's performance standards and prohibitions thus far have focused primarily on manure management and primarily on protecting the state's surface water quality. Next slide, please. Okay, as far as implementation of the performance standards in NR 151, the boots on the ground, as again, most of you know, is primary implementation is done by county land conservation departments. There are a number of tools that are in place to plan that implementation, as well as to provide some structure and enforcement regarding that implementation as well, such as county ordinances, MOUs with the Department of Natural Resources, and then the planning portion primarily occurs through county land and water resource management plans. Implementation of the rules also are tied to other programs. Two big ones are the Farmland Preservation Program, run or implemented by DATCAP, and then also the Phosphorus Multi-Discharger Variance Program at DNR. Next slide, please. So this is the rule process that we've begun so far since the Natural Resources Board gave approval back in December to develop targeted performance standards. Now the authority is described in the rule itself, and basically states the department shall develop these standards if the statewide performance standards do not achieve water quality standards. Next slide. Now, where do the targeted standards apply? They need to apply to specific areas in the state that have characteristics that necessitate the additional practices needed in order to meet water quality standards. So in general, various considerations that are used for creating a targeted performance standard and identifying where the standard actually applies would include factors such as geology and physical parameters, data or modeling that indicate that there are problems. And of course, there would be a pollutant of concern that would be specified as part of the targeted performance standard. Next slide, please. Now, the pollutant of concern in this case, of course, is nitrate and groundwater. Nitrate is Wisconsin's most widespread groundwater contaminant. As a lot of the state knows, this has been an issue for a long time, and nitrate levels around the state, as are shown on this map, are greater than 10 milligrams per liter are the ones that actually exceed the state and federal standards for nitrate in drinking water. Those darker areas on that map there would indicate areas, town areas, average concentrations by town where you're approaching an exceedance of the groundwater standard for nitrate. Large majority of the nitrate in groundwater, we know, originates from agricultural sources. Oop, go back one slide there. There you go. Thank you. Yeah, so just to repeat that. So a large majority of the nitrate in groundwater originates from agricultural resources. It's very clear from the available data that statewide standards and prohibitions that we currently have on the books are not helping to achieve the water quality standards for nitrates in certain areas of the state, especially those areas you see there, the darker areas, which tend to correlate oftentimes with those highly permeable soils, those coarse textured soils that are very susceptible to groundwater contamination. Therefore, the department is undertaking this process to put in place the targeted performance standards that are necessary for the state to actually attain those groundwater standards for nitrate around the state, and specifically in those areas that are targeted. All right, next slide. So through the rule, as we go through the process of asking the question, where will the targeted area be? There are a number of factors, of course, that would be used to help determine that. And one of those things that are specifically stated in the scope statement for the rule is soil permeability. For this map, this is a USGS map showing soil permeability around the state. The darker areas are the coarse textured, highly permeable soils. The lighter you get in the color, the lesser rate of permeability you see. So that's just one factor. Next slide, please. This map, the groundwater contamination susceptibility map that was put together by the Wisconsin Geological Natural History Survey several years ago with some assistance with the Department of Natural Resources. There's a lot in this map. It contains a number of factors that we might consider, which are all represented on this particular map. And it highlights areas, especially the ones in red, that are sensitive to groundwater contamination by taking into consideration really the ability of water to move from the land surface to the water table. The map does not show actual contamination areas of groundwater. It's not specific to nitrate, but it does show vulnerability by ranking the landscape on sort of a continuous gradient from high susceptibility to low susceptibility. The model this model accounts for 5 basic physical resource characteristics. And those things include the type of bedrock that you have underlaying the soils, soil depth to that bedrock, depth to the water table, basic soil characteristics such as soil permeability, and then characteristics of surficial deposits as well. Again, these are all factors that might be considered in the creation of this targeted performance standard. Next slide, please. Okay. Given that the large majority of nitrate contamination is due to agriculture, another important factor to consider is land cover or intensity of agricultural use. This is a basic map showing land cover of the state of Wisconsin back 2016. Those lighter colored areas, not the green ones, but lighter than that, sort of the beige, light beige, yellowish colors are the ones that are agricultural land use. So those are the areas that might also be in consideration for part of the targeted performance standard. Next slide, please. When you start to put some of these factors together, in general, you get a sense of the areas that are likely to be targeted by this performance standard for nitrate. Okay, next slide, please. So, even though we're embarking on this rule process for a nitrate targeted performance standard, there is some precedence. We have one example. First targeted performance standard in the state was put into place a couple of years ago, and that's the Silurian bedrock standard. And that gives an example of what at least one targeted performance standard actually looks like. And in this case, the pollutant of concern was pathogens or bacteria in drinking water. And the main factors used to define the targeted areas in this standard is geology and physical parameters, specifically areas with shallow soils over Silurian bedrock. And the Silurian bedrock area, as you can see, is defined as that eastern portion of the state, the predominant karst area in the eastern part of the state. So the way the rule language is drafted for the Silurian bedrock standard is that it identifies specific counties in eastern Wisconsin, and then identifies those counties and specifies that the areas that are targeted are the shallow soils over specific karst characteristics. And then the rule goes on to lay out the actual performance standards and prohibitions that apply depending on the soil depth to bedrock. That's sort of the key factor in that targeted performance standard. So that gives you some sense of how a targeted performance standard in this case might look or might work. Next slide, please. All right, let's change gears just a little bit here. So just speaking specifically to the process that we're in right now, the timeline for the rule overall is that we are in that first stage right at the top there, preparing the draft rule, which will occur over the bulk of this calendar year. As we prepare the draft rule, come next winter, we will then have a draft rule in place and develop an economic impact analysis for that rule and take that out for public comment. I believe the timeline for that, taking out the public comment, is late winter. And then, so that gives one opportunity for the public to chime in and provide comments on the rule. And then a little bit later in 2021, public hearings will be held during the summer, and of course, provide another comment period on the rule. And so two opportunities there for the public to chime in. And then presumably we would move on with the rule, make changes according to public comment, and then go in front of the Natural Resources Board in September, I think is the plan right now, at their September meeting of 2021, to ask for their approval and adoption of NR 151, and then on to the governor for approval, and then on to the legislature for review and possible hearings. All right, next slide, please. So during that time period, over the course of this calendar year, we are employing the use of Technical Advisory Committee currently. The purpose of that committee is to provide recommendations on the targeted agricultural performance standard, again, to achieve compliance with the nitrate groundwater standards. So our committee is made up of about 25 people, and we have a pretty diverse committee. Truly a technical committee in the sense that that everyone on the committee has practical or research experience related to aspects of this rule. And so we have a number of farmers on the committee. Many of them are also representatives of various agricultural groups as well, such as Farm Bureau and DBA and others. And then we have a number of researchers at the university, Discovery Farms, Wisconsin Geological Natural History Survey, NRCS, and others as well. And so that's the general makeup of our committee. And we're asking them to provide input on, again, defining these sensitive areas, defining the targeted areas. That's the place we're at right now, is that first bullet. During the next meeting, we're going to be heading into that second point, which is asking for their input on performance standards that will, of course, apply within those targeted areas. And then a little bit later on in the process, we're going to be getting into asking for some input as we move forward with a third-party economic analysis of the rule. Right now, we have plans to contract with economic researchers over at UW and UW Extension to help with a third-party economic analysis that would take a broad look at the costs and benefits of a draft rule. Meetings are scheduled, have been scheduled since the month of February. We've been having monthly meetings with the Technical Advisory Committee, and right now have scheduled meetings out through September. We did lose one meeting due to COVID in March, which was postponed, and so we sort of have an extra meeting there that we might use if needed and schedule later in the process. So far, the meetings that we've had with the Technical Advisory Committee have included discussions, a lot of background and contextual presentations having to do with things such as groundwater data, the health impacts of drinking water that's contaminated by nitrate, factors that determine nitrate groundwater quality, various agronomic challenges of nitrogen management on the farm, nitrogen use efficiency, nutrient management planning, and so on. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so kind of what we did during the last Technical Advisory Committee meeting was to get into this whole idea of asking for direct input on where the targeted area would actually be in the state. Because at some point, of course, just like the Silurian bedrock standard, this is all going to come down to the field scale, and farmers in particular asking the question, you know, is my field in the sensitive area or is it not in the sensitive area? And if so, of course, what standards actually apply within that area? Next slide, please. So again, the rule scope statement. The rule scope statement, when referring to the identification of these targeted areas, it first mentions soils and soil permeability as a factor. And this just gives this map here a basic overview of the main soil textures and how they're distributed around the state. Next slide. Now, in trying to answer that question of where the targeted area actually applies, the NRCS 590 technical standard, that's the technical standard for nutrient management, does provide some precedent here. The standard itself identifies certain soil characteristics, including highly permeable soils, such as pea soils, as areas where nitrogen application restrictions currently apply via the 590 standard. Other factors that are used in the 590 standard to identify those vulnerable soils also include R soils or rock soils that have less than 20 inches to bedrock, wet soils with less than 12 inches to the apparent water table, a soil depth of 5 feet or less over bedrock, and then areas that are within 1,000 feet of a public or community potable well. Next slide, please. All right, so these maps here are maps of the nitrogen restricted soils as identified in the 590 standard. These were put together by the Department of Ag Trade and Consumer Protection, DATCAP, when they incorporated the latest version of the nutrient management standard, the 590 standard, into its administrative rules, ATCP 50. So that was a couple of years ago. So, and these maps give a sense at the statewide level of just where those nitrogen restricted soils actually exist across the landscape. Yeah, go to the next slide, please. All right, so this gives you the southern half of the state, same maps, the nitrogen restricted areas in the southern part of the state. And you can see by taking a look at this that while I think there's general agreement that these nitrogen restricted soils overlay areas that are known to have high concentrations of nitrate and groundwater. We know of certain areas, for instance, the southern part of the state, Rock County in particular, and that area right around there, where you have high levels of nitrate and groundwater countywide, and yet the nitrogen restricted area is mostly located in the western part of that county. I just want to point that out for just a couple slides later. All right, next slide. So this is from the UW Stevens Point well water viewer, and this shows by town at some point average concentrations of nitrate in groundwater. And of course, the darker the area, the higher the concentration. So this is, as I mentioned before, one factor that could be used to identify the targeted areas. Next slide, please. The Technical Advisory Committee during, I guess it was a couple of meetings ago, heard a presentation from Minnesota specific to the Minnesota Groundwater Rule, which was promulgated not too long ago, relatively speaking, but that was a huge effort over a number of years of Minnesota, and it's a fairly, on the surface, it looks like a fairly complex rule, but the framework that exists within that rule is a fairly simple one, and can be broken down in a way that's pretty easily digestible and understood. So this chart here just kind of graphs out what Minnesota did as part of the sort of a similar exercise to where we are right now, identifying the areas where the standards are going to apply, and of course identifying those standards. And as you can see here, top left there, so they identify within their rule that cropland within what they refer to as drinking water supply management areas with nitrate that is greater concentration than 5.4 milligrams per liter. Those are the areas that would be identified and where regulations that apply. So they're part of Minnesota's target area, so to speak. And then that top box there, so cropland in vulnerable groundwater areas, and that's a definition within their rule. And then that lower box right below it identifies what's meant by vulnerable groundwater areas. So analysis was done to identify where there's coarse textured soils shallow to bedrock, less than 5 feet, and soils overlaying karst areas as identified in previous reports for the state of Minnesota. You take all those factors together, and where you've got vulnerable areas that exist in greater than 50% of a quarter section, then the entire quarter section is brought in and considered to be vulnerable groundwater areas. So similar process, taking into account a number of geological and physical factors to determine exactly where their targeted areas are. And then that box on the right there, so cropland with frozen soils, both within those groundwater our drinking water supply management areas and the vulnerable groundwater areas also have other rules that apply as well. Next slide, please. So during the last technical advisory committee, we put together this draft framework for the state of Wisconsin. This is partly based on the way our scope statement is structured, again, with the first mention in the scope statement having to do with soil permeability, but then also acknowledging the fact that there are many other factors that could be brought to bear on identifying targeted areas. This is very general, very broad, and what this acknowledges is that there might be areas of the state with very high soil permeability that right away you might say, yes, it's definitely within our sensitive area or targeted area and included as part of the rule. And then you've got other parts of the state perhaps where there's very low soil permeabilities that you could, for different reasons, exclude from the rule altogether. And then you've got the majority of soils, right, that are that medium permeability range. And that's where other factors would probably be needed, such as groundwater data, modeling data, or other types of analyses to indicate whether or not those particular soils are brought in as part of the targeted area or not part of the targeted area. And so we had a good discussion with the TAC about this. Next slide, please. We broke out into groups through Zoom as part of that meeting and had good discussions with small groups around a set of general questions, taking a look at that framework that I just showed. So the first question had to do with asking the committee how they would suggest that we actually define high, medium, and low permeability. The takeaways from that discussion, once all the notes came back together from the various breakout sessions, is that I would say in general, the committee saw good reason or support for including coarse textured soils, those highly permeable areas, as part of the targeted area. They also saw good reason and support for considering groundwater data as one factor and a primary factor to help define the targeted areas. In regards to that medium permeability classification, I think a lot of the committee members pointed out there's more work to be done there to determine exactly what we mean by medium permeability, to help define that and draw some lines around that as to what factors in terms of soil types or soil characteristics, as well as other factors, might help determine what belongs in the targeted area. And then they pointed out some other factors, such as, even in cases where you have low permeability soils, you may have preferential flow paths, macropores, other types of situations like that could actually give cause to include low permeability soils within the targeted area. Okay, next slide. Another question that was asked of the TAC is what soil characteristics are known and really talked about on the farm. And the reason we asked this question of the committee, or in part, was the fact that when it comes down to implementation at the end of the day of this rule, it's really helpful, and it was impressed upon us by the state of Minnesota, because this is one thing that they really tried hard to do as part of their rule too, was to use terms that are really familiar on the farm, right? Because that makes a lot of difference in terms of acceptance, adoption, and then ultimately implementation. So just generally, I mean, nothing of great surprise here, but a lot of the terms that are commonly used to describe various soil characteristics on the farm would include uh, various terms around soil texture, coarse, or otherwise, amount of organic matter that's actually present in the soil, saturation levels, droughty soils, infiltration, and then slope. And then a lot of the committee members, very much, there was overall consistency in comments from the committee members that that it's helpful if whatever terms are used are consistent with the terms in SNAP Plus, since SNAP Plus and the nutrient management standard is a well-known standard by a lot of farms. So that would be helpful. All right, next slide. Okay, the third question we asked of the TAC during this last meeting was, besides soil permeability, what are some obvious factors for inclusion into sensitive areas? And those common factors we heard amongst committee members, there's a lot of things here, but you see some themes starting to occur here, which is groundwater nitrate concentration, or groundwater quality, depth to bedrock, which was already talked about, karst areas, and then some other ones that get into some new information here, which is well information. So those points where, you know, the wells, the areas that we're actually trying to protect here, right? Safe drinking water, that's what this rule is about. Having information in regards to the depth of those wells, the construction quality, the proximity of those wells to agricultural land would all be useful as factors. And also, as I mentioned before, land use is a hugely important factor in the percentage of ag land use within certain areas. So that intensity factor of agricultural land use is an important one. Also, drainage factors such as ponding or excessively drained soils, and then also possibly land values and generally the quality of soils for agricultural use. All right, let's go to the next slide. The fourth question that was asked. So again, we put those maps of the nitrogen restricted soils as identified by the nutrient management standard in front of the committee. I've already gone through that. They're all listed here on the slide, what characteristics I'm referring to. But we asked the committee members, what are your thoughts on using these factors to clearly define sensitive areas or targeted areas? And what are some pros and cons to the use of these various factors? So in general, you know, in the pros category, there were overall support for the use of the nitrogen restricted areas to definitions of targeted areas. Committee, of course, pointed out that it's very consistent with what's already used, makes it easier to understand moving forward and to think about implementation over the long term. Some of the cons to this approach are probably more specific to that last, those areas that are within 1,000 feet of a public well. The setback distances, many committee members pointed out, may not actually be protective enough. They're too arbitrary, perhaps, because they don't truly represent the capture zones. You know, capture zones for a particular public well might be well larger than 1,000 than what's represented by a 1,000-foot radius around a well. And then there was also some comments having to do with the maps that contain this information already. So SNAP maps at the field scale may have some inaccuracies, and perhaps there's some ground truthing that needs to be done in certain cases. All right, next slide. All right, the last question that was asked to the committee: what other factors or analysis or modeling should be used to help determine sensitive areas? Sort of the catch-all question, right? So besides a lot of things that were already pointed out, field characteristics, slope, water table, soil water balance, and capacity are factors that we might take into account. Weather and time of year, whether agricultural lands are incorporating cover crops or perennial crops, and then different land use factors such as grazing versus cropland, the type of fertilizer that's actually being used on agricultural lands, commercial fertilizer versus manure. And then you could drill down further from there, of course. And then whether or not there's tile drainage that exists in those ag lands, soil water balance models, recharge rates to the aquifer versus runoff potential. Next slide, please. So that's where we are with the conversation with the committee. I will point out the next meeting is July 22nd, coming up here in just under 2 weeks. During this next meeting on the agenda, which will go out next week, we will be having further conversations with the Technical Advisory Committee, sort of a step 2 or 2.0, if you will, of the conversation that was had the last time. So based on the input that they gave us, and I just went over here, having to do with where are the targeted areas, what are the factors that should be used, we'll be coming back to them to help advance that conversation and get further input as to what the rule might say about those targeted areas. And also the next thing we'll be doing as part of that next meeting is getting some language in front of them, some draft language specific to the agricultural performance standard itself, and getting some input around the performance standard. So two big discussions to be had there, and more input to get from the Technical Advisory Committee. And then we'll move on from there. And we, like I said before, we have 2 more meetings scheduled, August and September, and potentially another meeting to use besides that, depending on a number of factors. Now the DNR website, I have the link up there, includes all of the agendas from the committee meetings, as well as materials that were handed out. Contains a Gov delivery link. So if you want updates on when agendas go out and any other announcements having to do with the rule process, as well as the Technical Advisory Committee, you can sign up and receive those notifications. We have some notes up from different meetings and conversations that have happened with the committee, and all presentations are up on that website as well. So with that, I will stop, and I've seen.
Oh, we do have one question waiting for you. Can you see the question from Patricia, or would you like me to read it?
Is it up in the chat box?
Yes, it is. And she's asking, when looking at well water data, I would think it's important to look at the number of wells in a town with high nitrates, as well as the age of the well test. For instance, in Jefferson County, some of the towns might have 1 to 2 wells that have tested high for nitrates. So the entire town is mapped with high nitrates in the Stevens Point maps. Has the committee been considering this information?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think there's a number of questions that come along with that, right? So if groundwater data is being used to identify targeted areas, what's the appropriate scale? What's the exactly, so age of data, types of wells that would factor into that. Those are all questions within that are going to be put in front of the committee during this next meeting. So they haven't given direct input just yet on trying to answer those questions, but we have received some input without fully being prompted on some of those factors, certainly, because it's on the mind of many of the committee members. but we will be directly asking those questions during this next meeting, though.
Thanks, Chris. Are there any other questions at this time? I'll go through a couple of housekeeping things here and give you another minute to, oh, do we have another? Oh, Christina shared some more information on the chat. If you have any questions for Chris, please post them in there in the next couple minutes. Just want to remind you that this session will end at 9:45, and then in this room, starting at 9:50, the financial implications of COVID-19 on counties starts in this room. If you're interested in the implementing water quality-based standards, challenges and opportunities, that will be starting in room B, and you can find that link in the virtual agenda. So I'll give, any questions for Chris?
Chris, this is Dan Zur. I can throw one out to you. I know that the legislature's Water Quality Task Force discussed some possible funding for more testing, for more groundwater testing. And I just wanted to ask you, in light of a lot of the data that comes back from Stevens Point is based on voluntary testing done by private well owners. And is there plans within DNR to try to establish some more testing to establish a little bit more of a baseline beyond the data that's already available? Maybe you covered that and I missed it.
No, I didn't address that directly. So that's a really good question. So if, I think the bigger question is if groundwater data is going to be taken into account at some portion of this rule, what are the plans to bolster that monitoring, right? And I think there's certainly some opportunities there. As I understand it, there's some rule changes made to the well code within the last year or two that would bring some new data in-house and increase the amount of data on nitrate specifically that's available. I don't really know a whole lot of details beyond that offhand. Our drinking and groundwater folks could certainly help fill us in at some point on many of those details and just what that means for the amount of data that we get around the state. But as I understand it, that would be occurring. Now, plans to move forward with additional testing beyond that and just what that looks like, that's certainly something that we are considering as part of this rule process and how that fits into the framework of the rule, so and implementation of the rule. So that's, in general, it's on our minds.
Thanks.
Okay, it looks like there's no other questions at this time, and we're about out of time anyway. So thank you very much for joining the virtual county con meeting, and stay tuned for the COVID-19 implications for counties in this room. Thank you, and stay safe, everyone.